Yeah. Okay. So you have the notes with you. Yeah. Very good. Let's make the great beginning of the today's evening. Can you please check on the voice? All right, right? Okay. So after 2 years of hibernation without students before, as online teachers, we had been clandestinely waiting for this good day to come, because the whole joy is in sitting alone with you and studying. So please inform Bhagya to inform everybody. Yeah, to join through the link. Your good name, doctor? Sahitya. Teja. Huh? Very good, very good. So we have Teja and Sahitya who are over here. So there are totally 8,000 points in entire general medicine. In that, in cardiology, we have around 1,200 high-yield facts, high-yield points that you need to really master. So we'll run through them wherever we need to understand in a greater detail. Let us review that, and that's how we progress. Now, where do we see pulses alternates? One strong beat, one weak beat, one strong beat, one weak beat. That is called pulses alternates. Typically, we see it in left ventricular failure is what you need to basically remember. Then Bispherians pulse. There are two peaks in the systole. So whenever the ventricle contracts, then we get the pulse. But there are two peaks in the systole. Is typically a feature of aortic regurgitation plus or minus aortic stenosis, and in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Why in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy? Because in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the interventricular septum and the mitral valve leaflet come closer, and from the ventricle, when the blood is moving into the root of aorta, these two will touch each other and block the blood from flowing from left ventricle into aorta. From left ventricle aorta into the aorta, the blood is going. So during that time, interventricular septum, which is hypertrophic, and mitral valve leaflet, they both come in touch each other and prevent the free flow of the left ventricular blood into the aorta. But when the ventricle starts systole, this touching doesn't happen. In the middle of the systole, this touching happens, right? But after that, once more, the left ventricle will overcome that block and once more push the blood. So that is the reason, the moment left ventricle goes into systole, you get one pulse, peak, and touching happen, obstruction happen. Then once more it has overcome that, and then it pushes the blood into the aorta, then the second peak comes. So two peaks during the single systole is what you see in the case of the hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy and AR plus or minus AS. You'll remember that. Then pulses paradoxus. Normally, whenever we are taking inspiration, there is an increased venous return. Because of that increased venous return, venous return from the entire body will go into the right atrium. That will go into right ventricle. Then right ventricle become fat. So when it becomes fat, the interventricular septum will push into left ventricle. so that the left ventricle output will diminish. This normally happens during inspiration. The pressure of the pulse will come down. But this happens more significantly if there is any cardiac tamponade. So that is the reason pulsus paradoxus is at the time of inspiration, there is a significant fall, more than 10 millimeters mercury fall in the pulse, right? And that is called pulsus paradoxus. So pulsus paradoxus, where do you see? Pulsus paradoxus, we see it in cardiac tamponade. Here's what you need to remember. Now the question is, why you call it as paradox? Why you still call paradox? Because it falls so much that pulse is not palpable, but if you put stethoscope, heart is still beating. That is the reason it is called pulsus paradoxus. Nothing that it is opposite to what happens normally, right? So normally only during inspiration there is a fall of the pulse pressure in the pulse, but more so if there is a cardiac tamponade and the pulse become absent, and what you listen is only the heartbeat, and that is the reason it is called pulsus paradoxus. So where do you see pulsus paradoxus is the favorite question of the examiner. So SVC obstruction, COPD, constrictive pericarditis, similarly pulmonary embolism, hypovolemic shock, pericardial tamponade. So both pericardial tamponade and also constrictive pericarditis, we see the pulsus paradoxus is what you need to remember. So 5 causes. Close the eyes and remember 5 causes. Now, dichrotic pulse. What is the meaning of it? Dichrotic pulse is the most important question. There are 2 palpable waves, but one is in the systole, other is in the diastole. Alright? So this is different from bigeminous. Bigeminous, both of them are during systole only. So that is a dichrotic, Westphalian pulse. Both of them are in systole. Okay? Now, where do you see a one wave in diastole, one wave in systole? So typically we see it in the dilated cardiomyopathy. Can you give me one very common reasons why patients go into dilated cardiomyopathy in India? Chronic hypertension lead to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. But why dilated cardiomyopathy? What leads to dilated cardiomyopathy? I'm very happy to see we have around 3 to 4 online classmates. Very good. So just check whether the voice is manageable. Okay. Because I'm not using any mic into the system. Okay. Now, let us talk about the JVP. A wave, C wave, B wave, 3 positive waves. X descent, Y descent are the 2 negative waves. That's what you need to remember. So, what is the reason for A wave? First of all, you should remember, whenever we talk about JVP, remember whether a particular wave or a descent is during the systole or diastole. Right? Whose systole? Ventricle. Whose diastole? Ventricle's diastole. Now, if you look at ventricle's diastole, that means ventricle is becoming pregnant by the vomiting of the blood from the atria into the ventricle. So ventricular filling is divided into 3 1/3. Ventricle filling is divided into 3 1/3. First 1/3 of the filling of the ventricle, why does it happen? Because the atria is filled from all the great veins, full of blood. The moment the valve opens, the blood jumps into Ventricle. So first 1/3 is because atria is full of blood and ventricle is empty, and that makes the blood flow from rich to poor. Second 1/3, what did Newton's law say? The apple falls from the tree. Apple falls from the tree because of the gravity. So also, the atria are higher, ventricles are lower. So by the gravitational pull, the blood will move from atria to ventricle. Last 1/3 of the ventricular diastole. That is the time when atria wakes up from the sleep. What's happening? It will say, like a mother-in-law got up, Bahu coffee banao. So same way, atria will contract and push the blood into the ventricle. Last 1/3 by contraction. And when atria is contracting and trying to push the blood into the ventricle, some pressure will pass back into vein. That is how you get the A wave. So quickly tell me, doctor, A wave is during which part of the diastole? Last 1/3. Last 1/3 of the diastole. And it is because of atrial contraction. Can you tell me a condition where the atria is not contracting? Atrial fibrillation. That is the reason. What is the condition where A wave is absent? Atrial fibrillation is what we remember. Next comes C wave. So basically, C wave is a systolic wave. Systolic. That means ventricle is contracting and pushing the blood into aorta or into pulmonary artery on the right side. So ventricle is undergoing systole. And ventricle, when it is undergoing systole, right? When the ventricle is undergoing systole, that time it not only pushes the blood into the aorta, it will kick back some pressure into atria, which is behind it, and that makes the tricuspid valve to bulge back into atria, rising pressure in atria, rising pressure in the JVP. That is responsible for C wave. So why does C wave occur? C wave occurs because of contraction of the ventricular systole, initial part of the ventricular systole, because of the bulging of the tricuspid valve back into the atria is what you need to emphatically remember for the tomorrow's exam. Very good to see oddity the doc. Very good, doctor. So from a live class, when we broadcast, it will not be very optimum. So I hope our online students will apologize me for that. Next week we will set up proper Hollywood setting so that broadcast will occur seamlessly online. But you guys come to the class, because only when students are there, teachers get inspiration to teach. Now, doctor, so one of the favorite questions asked in the exam, where do you see the C wave? It is during the isovolumic contraction of the ventricle. Isovolumetric means aortic valve is still closed, tricuspid valve is still closed, and the ventricle is contracting to build pressure. During that time, some back pressure happens. So, you will fill up the blank in the tomorrow's exam. You should not forget. Fill up the blank in tomorrow's exam. Very good. Oddity, the doc is giving a good compliment. It is always great to hear from you, sir. Good. So, next topic. X descent. So, when will X descent happen? X descent also happens when the ventricle is undergoing systole. Systole is like daddy going to office. When the daddy goes to office, what will mummy do? Mummy will stretch her legs, watch the TV, and then have a little bonavita. Atrium is relaxing. When the ventricle is contracting, atrium is relaxing. Because of the relaxation of the atrium getting ready itself to get filled from the great veins, during that time the pressure in the atrium will fall down. And that fall is called as X descent. X descent is because of atrial relaxation. X descent is occur during the time of systole or diastole? Systole. When the ventricle is undergoing systole, atrium is relaxing. Right? So that is what you need to basically remember. Then comes the V wave. V wave is a positive wave. V wave is a positive wave. So when the ventricle is undergoing systole, what is atrium doing? It is relaxing. Then it is getting filled with blood from great veins. Because of the filling of the blood from the great veins into the atrium, the pressure in the atrium will build, and that is called as V wave. The positive wave is what you need to basically remember. Now, you know A wave. A wave is in diastole or systole? Diastole. Early part or late part of diastole? Late part of the diastole. It is because of atrial contraction. Then comes the X descent. X descent is ventricular, diastole or systole? Ventricular systole. And X descent is because of no looking into paper, all mind, walk into heart, sleep in the heart, think in the heart. Then you are the cardiologist, right? So think yourself that you walked into the chamber of the heart. So X descent is because the relaxation of the atria when the ventricle is undergoing contraction, and that leads to drop of the pressure, right? And the V wave is because of also occur during ventricular systole, and that is because of atria got filled from the great veins, and the atrium became pregnant. That is the reason there is a rise of pressure, and that is the reason you have V wave. V wave is what you need to remember. Now, X descent is accentuated. Accentuated. So when will X descent become accentuated? You should remember three important causes for accentuation of the X descent. That means a prominent X descent. It happens in constrictive pericarditis, cardiac tamponade, and in restrictive cardiomyopathy. Now the question comes, sir, why X descent become accentuated in these three conditions? Okay, now I'll ask you a question. Throughout your MBBS, you are getting gold medals, distinctions. Suddenly, you are not qualified in NEET PG. Will your descent will be more accentuated, or throughout MBBS you are failing and you also is not qualified? So when will it be more? It become accentuated first time. Abhimanadhanudaina Suyodhanunika ituvanti avamaram. You feel that, oh my God, what an insult! Bloody, I am a great man and I fell down. In constrictive pericarditis, cardiac tamponade, restrictive cardiomyopathy, in all these conditions, when the atria started relaxing and its pressure was falling down, the pressure point at which it was, from where it is falling, is very high. That's the reason the X descent is accentuated in these three conditions. Okay? You'll remember for the tomorrow's exam. Now, In which condition X descent is reduced. Reduced. Typically, whenever there is any right ventricular dilatation, X descent is reduced. So basically, if there is a right ventricular dilatation, same logic. The atria is not at a very big gradient with ventricle. See, basically, when ventricle is all relaxed, right? So atrium also was not used to build a lot of pressure. That's the reason atria, when relaxing, there is not much of pressure drop because the starting point of that pressure point itself is low. That's the reason X descent is reduced with right ventricular dilatation is what you need to remember. See, every point is a parallel. Mutyam. You have to remember, I will tell you, 80,000 points in all 19 subjects. If you don't need any different notes. This is the notes of mother of all notes. But every point that I have given you in the notes, closing the eyes, you must be able to rattle out. If you do that at least once, you will get. To remember, develop some funda bunda logic. Edo okati Subbalakshmi auto digindi, Subbarao bus ekkadu, something or other you remember, right? But remember, that is a whole idea. So every Sunday, if you all come, slowly we will do the revision of these 80,000 points. Totally it comes into 3,000 pages notes. Each page has around 25 points, right? So these 3,000 pages of notes, in this 25 points also when you look at, right? Some points you will know. Those points which you feel that you like to bookmark, micro bookmark, just make a tick that this is the point I want to revise once more. Closing the eyes, can I recall? Then one more thing what I did in the notes is, what part you need to recall, I made it bolder. What part your friend or grandma should ask you as a question, I left it not bold. It's like a notes only, right? So that's how, and this notes I myself personally sitting and preparing the notes. This is the final notes of my lifetime, having had driven the things all the time. You check if anybody is there. Now comes absent X wave. What is the simple one word meaning? X wave occurs because of the atrial relaxation. Somebody is preventing the atrium from relaxing. Somebody is preventing the pressure from falling down. That is the reason X descent is absent. So what condition will that? If there is a tricuspid regurgitation. So when is X descent happening? When the ventricle is undergoing systole. That time atrium is relaxing. But regurgitation is happening same time. During ventricular systole only regurgitation is happening and blood is coming and falling in atrium. When it is planning to relax and pressure is supposed to fall down, it won't let it to fall down. That's the reason X descent is absent and reversed. Reversed means instead of fall, in fact there is a rise in the pressure. That is tricuspid regurgitation. Then comes Y descent. So atria contracted. In the last 1/3 of diastole, you think in the lines of systole, diastole. In that mood you need to get into. Atria contracted, pushed the blood into ventricle, ventricular diastole over. last one third is over. Then what happened? Ventricular systole started. That time atria relaxed, X descent, right? Then during that ventricular systole, atria got filled with blood from great veins, so you got V wave. And ventricle finished systole. Ventricle also finished systole. Then what will happen? Ventricular diastole will begin. So I told you, first one third of the ventricular diastole is because of what? Ventricular systole is over, it is empty. Atria is fully pregnant with the blood, already V wave came. From atria into ventricle, the blood will jump the moment the valve open. And because of that sudden gush of the blood from the atria into the ventricle during the first one third of the ventricular diastole, what will happen to the pressure in the atria? Decrease. And that decrease is called Y descent. Understand? So Y descent occurs during first one third of the ventricular diastole. After that, A wave happens because last one third of the ventricular diastole, atrium contracts. Then after that, what will happen? X descent happen. And why that X descent happen? Because during ventricular systole, atrium relaxes. That's the reason.
So it is A wave, Y wave, and X descent.
A wave is there. Yeah. Ventricular diastole, last one third is over. Yes. Then ventricle started systole, and that pushed the tricuspid back. Okay. That's the reason you got the C wave. Then after that, atrium is relaxing. Because of that, what you got? X descent. X descent. After that, what happened? Atrium is filled with from the great veins. So you got V wave. And after that, what happened? Ventricular systole is over, diastole started, and the valves opened, and the atrial blood ran into ventricle, and you got the Y descent. That's what you need to basically remember. So, doctor, Y descent is typically happening during diastole or in systole? It is happening during ventricular diastole. During first one third or last one third? First one third. And it is because of the opening of the AV valve and rushing of the blood from atria into ventricle. That's what you need to basically remember. Alright? Now, what leads to accentuation of the Y descent? Once more the same story. What is the story? Any descent is grand, accentuated, if the starting point of the fall is at a higher pressure. So imagine, if there is a tricuspid regurgitation, what happened? Atria got filled from the great veins, and also during that time what happened? Regurgitant blood came from ventricle into atria. So atria has more blood. So next time when the tricuspid valve open and blood is leaving, the start of the fall is happening from higher point. See, when atrium, if there is a tricuspid regurgitation, when the ventricle is undergoing systole, atria is getting relaxed and getting filled from great veins. During that time, the great veins are bringing blood. Same time, this ventricular tricuspid regurgitation also is bringing the blood back from ventricle into atria. So overall atrial blood volume became increased. That's the reason pressure point is high. So that is the reason the fall is also higher, is more rapid. So that is the tricuspid regurgitation. Same logic applies for constrictive pericarditis. Then what makes the Y descent to become reduced is the next important question. If tricuspid regurgitation makes Y descent high, what should tricuspid stenosis should do?
It should prevent that.
Tricuspid stenosis should have an opposite effect. So it is reduced in tricuspid stenosis because what is the cause for the Y descent? When the tricuspid valve opens, the atrial blood is going into ventricle. If the stenosis is there, will it let it happen easily? No. That is the reason tricuspid stenosis will make the Y descent become attenuated. Similarly, any right atrial myxoma, same impeding effect. Now, if the Y descent is reduced, what is it going to say? There's an obstruction at the level of the right atrioventricular level is what you need to understand. It can be because of the myxoma or it can be because of stenosis. Very good. Large A wave. If it is there, where will you get large A wave? A wave is because of what? Contraction of the atria during the last 1/3 of the diastolic. Same story continues. That is called general medicine. Right? So there are 8,000 points. 8,000 పాయింట్లని అనుసంధానం చేయాలంటే అధ్యక్ష you can finish revision of 60 points in 1 hour. So 8,000 points we can finish in about 100-120 hours. Right? First time. Out of these 8,000 points, there are about 2,000 points that require frequent revision. So that 2,000 points you should revise in the last moment. 6,000 points, one time you read means you should never forget. Out of these 8,000. Right? Let us see. What is the point number we are at? 17 point? Very good. Not bad. Large A wave. Obviously, there is a tricuspid stenosis. In the last 1/3 of the diastole, when the atrium contracts and has to push the blood into the ventricle, it has to negotiate the blood through a narrow valve. That is the reason the pressure will increase. So large A wave, tricuspid stenosis, large A wave, pulmonary stenosis, large A wave, pulmonary hypertension, because pulmonary artery, right ventricle, pulmonic valve, tricuspid valve, all are in the same line, no? Right? Just like Kajipet station, Balarsha station, Bhopal station, Gwalior station, like that, they're all in the same continuity is what you need to remember. So you remember these 4 causes and the underlying cause. Once more, when you are going back to the reading room, no? Friends need to do this revision only. Ari chepra large area 3 causes kallu muskuni cheppanaru. Ante meeku right side emunnadi rasta teliste telisipotundi. You know tricuspid valve, after that pulmonic valve, and after that pulmonary artery. Tricuspid stenosis, pulmonic stenosis, pulmonary hypertension, they all lead to large A wave. Canon A waves. Canon means it will be ting, it will be rising. So it happens in junctional rhythm. So what is the meaning of junctional rhythm? SA node starts the rhythm, AV node delays the rhythm, then the rhythm will go into, electrical activity will go into ventricle. That's a normal order. But if AV node itself takes up the pacemaker activity, then what will happen? It need not wait for SN. Directly it will make the ventricle to beat according to its law. And atria beat by the, who is the boss for atria? SA node. For ventricles, who is the boss? AV node. Because of that, there is no coordination. So, if the boss is only one boss, then there is a coordination. Because of that, what will happen? When the atrium contracts, the tricuspid valve is supposed to be in an open condition, but it is not open, it is closed. It's like you are walking and you are hitting, you are banging your head against a closed valve. So, ting, 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 pressure will rise. That is called?
Due to atrial filling.
It is the canon A wave because of the junctional rhythm. Right? So this is how you find canon A waves. Typically, canon A waves can be irregular, canon A waves can be regular. Irregular canon A waves are seen in AV dissociation, complete heart block. And canon A waves regularly happen in junctional rhythm. So these are the 2 points you need to remember. Absent A waves you already know. Atrial fibrillation. Then a prominent X descent, prominent Y descent. Both the things are prominent. That means when these descents are happening, both the descents are happening, the starting point is at a high pressure point. That happens in case of constrictive pericarditis. Please remember, X descent prominent, Y descent prominent, where you see constrictive pericarditis. Whereas X descent is prominent, but Y descent is absent. Where? In cardiac tamponade. Now comes a very interesting question. Why is it like that? X descent is prominent. What is tamponade? Tamponade is a lot of fluid around the heart, between pericardium and heart. So, what is meant by Y descent? Why Y descent happen? The moment tricuspid valve open, atrial blood will flow into ventricle, and that lead to development of Y descent. But if there is a tamponade, what will tamponade will be doing? Tamponade will be pressing the ventricle, just like you are pressing under your foot. You put a football and you are pressing with your foot. Like that, it is pressing on the ventricle.
It will over-exaggerate pressure.
It will also exaggerated pressure. It is pressing the ventricle. Because of that, there is a phenomenon that happens when you do the 2D echo. It's called diastolic collapse of ventricle. Diastolic collapse of ventricle. Right? During diastole, what is ventricle supposed to be? Distant. But because the tamponade, what is happening to the ventricle? It is collapsing if you happen to do the 2D echo. So at the time of diastole, when you are seeing, the ventricle, instead of getting distended, it is becoming collapsed. So if the ventricle collapses during diastole, can the atrium fill the blood into the ventricle? No. Right? Because it's collapsed, how can it push the blood into the ventricle? Because of that, what is the cause for the Y descent to happen? If the atrium pushes the blood into the ventricle, during the time of the ventricular diastole, if the ventricle receives the blood nicely, then the pressure in the atrium will fall down. But if the ventricle is collapsing during diastole, the atrium cannot vomit the blood into it. And because of that, what will happen?
Again, the atrium will get full with the blood and
The pressure in the atrium remains like that without falling down. That is the reason the Y descent is absent. Agree? So please remember, doctor, the Y descent is absent because of the diastolic collapse of the ventricle, because of that surrounding cardiac tamponade, which is preventing the atrial blood from moving into the ventricle and preventing the atrium to come down off its pressure and preventing the Y descent from happening. All right? So that is what you need to remember. Manu, can you please make it a little lower? It is straight coming on to me. The AC. Now, constrictive pericarditis, unlike that, what happens in constrictive pericarditis? X descent is prominent and Y descent is also prominent. But X descent is prominent, but Y descent is absent in tamponade. This is the favorite MCQ in the tomorrow's NEET PG exam, doctor. You remember me in the exam hall. Just if you remember, because of the diastolic collapse of the ventricle, the Y descent is absent in tamponade. I am successful to influence you. Now comes restrictive cardiomyopathy. Now just it should not blow on to me, that's all. It's blowing to me. Yeah. Restrictive cardiomyopathy. So, in restrictive cardiomyopathy also, when the X descent is starting, because it's surrounding restrictive myocardium, the pressure is at very high point in atrium. Because of that, the X descent is prominent. That is the story of JVP. Now comes heart sounds. Fatafat, 4-5 points about each of these heart sounds you should know. First heart sound, it is a high pitched sound. High pitched. Pitch is what? Frequency. Two things, frequency and pitch. Pitch is frequency. A high frequency is a low amplitude. A low frequency is high amplitude. Dil hum kare. Bhupen Hazarika you heard, right? Muhammad Rafi you heard. All the male singers, they have high amplitude, low pitch. But Lata Mangeshkar will have high pitch, low amplitude. You use bell diaphragm in the stethoscope. Bell is for always bell. It is whenever the between the pitch and what you call between the pitch and amplitude. If you have a high amplitude, bell is needed. That means high amplitude, low frequency, you use the bell, and low amplitude, high frequency, you use the diaphragm, right? A honeybee, the sound that comes, honeybee. Let's say example of a high frequency, low amplitude. Respiratory sounds, they also have low amplitude, high frequency. All right. So for every murmur, you should know high frequency, low frequency, every heart sound. Right. So first heart sound is high pitched, low amplitude, and lub is what you listen. 25 to 45 hertz is a frequency, and 0.14 seconds is the duration. Please don't forget these unfortunate values. Second heart sound is also high pitched. High pitched means low amplitude. Low amplitude means you need to use the diaphragm. And duck. It is 50 hertz, 0.11 second. Third heart sound. Now comes an interesting concept.
Low pitch and high amplitude.
Low pitch, high amplitude required bell. First and second heart sounds are high pitch and low amplitude. Hence you will use diaphragm. Did I say bell? No. Now comes third heart sound. So why do you get third heart sound? Very simple. How is the ventricular diastole is happening? The moment the AV valves open, fully pregnant atria are vomiting into the ventricle. That's how ventricular diastole is happening. Before diastole, what did ventricle do? It undergone systole. Systole means what did it do? The ventricle contracted, pushed the blood into the aorta. And what is meant by ejection fraction? If it received 100 ml blood, it will push 65 ml blood out. That is called ejection fraction. That means still 35 ml remain with it. Now, ventricle failed. And when that means ejection fraction is low, that means systole happened, but instead of 65 ml, it only pumped 25 ml, and 75 ml remained with it at the end of the systole. So at the end of the systole, that means inside the ventricle, which is supposed to become more or less empty, with just 35 ml blood inside it, instead of 35 ml, it is having 70-80 ml. I mean, more blood is there. That time, the diastole started, and the blood is jumping into a empty ventricle or into a ventricle filled with some blood already. If there is a ventricular failure, filled with some blood, into that it is jumping. And because of the jump, what happened? There's a splashing sound. That is called S3, third heart sound. Third heart sound, systolic or diastolic? Third heart sound, is it systolic or diastolic in timing? Very good, diastolic. Third heart sound is an indication of failure of what? Left ventricle. I mean ventricular failure. Left-sided S3 is a sign of ventricular failure. Because the ventricle failed, it is unable to eject. At the end of the systole, it still has some stagnant pool of blood. Into that, when the diastole started, the blood came, they jumped, and that led to splashing of the sound, and that led to S3. Got? So, S3. But S3 is what kind of sound? S3 is a soft, low-pitched sound with a high amplitude. I want to use a diaphragm or I want to use a bell. What do you want to use? Bell. Very good. First, second के लिए इस्तेमाल करो diaphragm. Third, fourth के लिए इस्तेमाल करो bell. Is what you need to remember. And third heart sound is whose failure? Ventricular failure. My not getting seat in NEET PG is whose failure? My girlfriend's failure. Because she inspired me to enjoy life more. And I have no time to study. So that's the point. So that's the reason S3 is called ventricular gallop. Is what you need to remember. And please don't forget, 0.1 second is the duration. It is a rumbling sound. Low pitched. Rumbling means kind of sound is called rumbling. Fourth heart sound. Once more. Ventricle is undergoing diastole. Right? First one, that is because atrium is pregnant, it pushed the blood into the ventricle because of the pressure difference. Second one, third is because of the gravitational pull. Last one, third, who got up? Mother-in-law got up. atrial water. It undergone contraction and pushed the blood into ventricle. Right? Assume that fellow is having hypertension. Hypertension. Because of the hypertension, he has a left ventricular hypertrophy and a hypertrophied ventricle. Is it easy for atrium to contract and push into a simple ventricle or a hypertrophied ventricle? Simple ventricle. So if there is a hypertrophy, what the atrium should do in the last 1/3? More pressure to push the blood. And the sound generated because of that is fourth heart sound. So fourth heart sound is a diastolic or systolic sound? Diastolic. Last 1/3 or first 1/3?
Last month.
And S3 is a diastolic or systolic sound? Diastolic. Is it early 1/3 or last 1/3? Early 1/3. When just atrial blood jumped into a splash of, into a pool of blood and created the splash. Alright, doctor? So, we used to have some of the wonderful cardiologists as teachers. So they used to dance, they used to jump, they used to make us to make the sounds. They used to hold our hand and take us to the patient and show me the S3, show me the S4, show me the S3, show me the S4. I still remember my professor, who I consider as God, Professor Dr. Shantaram sir, he is the father of cricketer Lakshman. He made me to go and listen 100 patients to appreciate S3. I still remember feeling the S3 without 2D echo. He made one member of parliament pushed into the what you call angio, into the cath lab and got an angio. Right? Because he was having a heart failure. Clinically. But modern time, who cares? 2D echo, everything. But for entrance exam, you have to. So that's the point. So fourth heart sound is low pitched heart sound. Fourth heart sound frequency is less than 20 hertz. And it is a high amplitude. Yes. That's the reason you have to use the bell. Yes, sir. And it is last diastolic. Last 1/3 of the diastolic. And that is what you have to basically remember. That means lub, dub, dr, dr, lub, dub, dr, dr. Because dr, dr is only the kind of a sound that you listen by the S3 and S4. They are not heard that like lub, dub. And between lub and dub, is it systolic or diastolic? Lub means AV1 closed, a ventricle contracted. S2 means end of the contraction, aortic valve closed. Between the lub and the dub, what you have, what is ventricle doing? Systolic. Between dub and lub, what is ventricle doing? Diastolic. Lub and dub, systolic. Dub and lub, diastolic. S3, S4 are? That's the reason, where do you listen them? You listen S1, you listen S2, then lub, then drr, then once more lub. Okay? That's good. So what is first heart sound is because of, it is due to sudden closure of mitral and tricuspid valve. Second heart sound, aortic and pulmonary valve. Third heart sound due to rapid ventricular filling during the early 1/3 of the diastolic. Fourth heart sound is due to contraction, atrial contraction during the last 1/3 of diastolic. Very good. And the first heart sound is the beginning of ventricular systole. Lub means AV valve closed in, ventricle started contracting. Second heart sound means end of the ventricular systole. And third heart sound typically occurs during the middle third of the diastole. And fourth heart sound is end of the last 1/3 of the diastole. right?
Yes.
End of the diastole, what will you listen? First heart sound or second heart sound?
First time.
First heart sound, because end of the diastole you hear first heart sound, then systole continues, end of the systole you hear second heart sound, then once more diastole continues, end of the diastole you hear first heart sound. That's the reason S4 के बाद क्या आएगा? S4 के बाद क्या आएगा? S1. So S1, S2, S1, S2, S1 के बाद systole, end of the systole, you have the S2, beginning of the diastole, then the time S3, then S4, then comes S1. Good. So bell is used for what? Very good. And diaphragm is required for S2. See, that way, this automatically you know now. You don't need to revise. Alright? Some points you need to. So out of these 80,000, 75,000 to 80,000 points, you need to identify what will need to be revised. Okay? Now, soft S1, first heart sound is soft. So what are the causes for that? First heart sound is soft. That means between your diaphragm and the heart, something is there in the middle that is preventing you to listen it easily. Right? Because the high frequency, low amplitude, high frequency, high pitched, low amplitude sound. So any obesity, pleural effusion, emphysema, pericardial effusion, they all prevent the S1 from being heard, and that is the reason for soft S1. Then another thing, S1 is because of what? What is whose closure is responsible? AV valve closure is responsible. Right? At the end of ventricular diastole or systole? No looking, imagining. End of the ventricular diastole. End of the ventricular diastole, what happened? Ventricle became fully pregnant with the blood. Atria is nicely relaxed. Right? Empty. So high pressure in the ventricle will kick the AV valve and close the
Opening door, it closes.
Yes, it closes the valve. Right? So at the beginning of the ventricular diastole, left atrial pressure is high. Ventricle is empty, so low. End of the ventricular diastole, what happened? Ventricular pressure is high and atrial pressure is low, which is closing it. And the point at which this crossover happened, where ventricular pressure is high, atrial pressure is low, that pressure crossover point जो होता है, the pressure crossover point जो होता है, that decides how loud you listen. Understand? So, any decrease in this pressure crossover, that means left ventricle building the pressure and atria losing the pressure, and the pressure crossover, if it is developing slowly, then the S1 become softer. Imagine, you have two widely opened valve. Leaflets are widely opened. From atria, blood is going into ventricle, right? Suppose if this moving of the blood from atria into ventricle is happening fast, then what will happen? The pressure crossover will happen quickly, and the closure of the valve occur quicker. At that time, the two valves are wide apart. Then the sound will be higher. But If the atrioventricular pressure crossover is happening slowly towards the end of the diastolic, by the time already valves came closer,
Yes, sir, right.
so really they don't make much sound, hence it becomes softer. Understand?
Yes.
So anything that decrease the rate of the building of the pressure in the left ventricle and the left atrioventricular pressure crossover is very slow. That is the reason for soft S1 is what you need to basically remember. Now tell me what happens in mitral regurgitation.
Reverse.
What happens in mitral regurgitation? So in mitral regurgitation, right, the blood in the atrium is
Flowing back.
regurgitated into atria, right? So from atria, when the blood is going into the ventricle, ventricle is building pressure, but atria has so much blood that the pressure inside the atria will not fall down that fast. So the pressure changeover is becoming delayed. And the valves by the time already came closer. That's the reason it is a soft S1. You remember that? So the pressure crossover, rate of pressure crossover between ventricle and atrium, if it is lower, for whatever the reason, atrium is getting some money from NATO countries. Atrium is a Ukraine. It's getting ammunition from NATO countries. So will it yield to Russia easily? No. So pressure crossover, will it occur fast? Pressure crossover.
It delays.
It gets delayed. Because of that, are you hearing bomb sounds? No, it's soft valve. Soft S1. Right? Similarly, cardiomyopathy, mixed edema, blah blah blah. That's good. Then soft S1 also occur whenever the PR interval is prolonged. PR interval and the velocity of the valve closure is prolonged. Then by the time the closure is happening, they are touching each other, they already came closer to each other. So that is the reason that we reach development of soft S1. So prolonged PR interval is basically the feature of first degree heart block is what you need to remember. Alright? Now, soft S1 also happen when the mobility of the valve is affected. For example, if the valve is very pliable, it will hit. If it is very woody, calcified, even if it is hitting, no sound is heard. That's the reason calcification of the valve in chronic rheumatic heart disease lead to development of a soft S1 is what you need to remember. Then, if there is any long-standing mitral stenosis, you can try camera. Stand is not there, cables are not there. Okay. All right. Are you ready with the quiz? Okay. Long-standing mitral stenosis is associated with severe calcification of the mitral valve, and that leads to development of soft S1 is what you need to remember. What is the point number we are in?
44.
Very good. 45. Our batting rate must be 100 per hour. Right? The Manta entrance, we topped the entrance exams like this only, point to point to point to point to point to point, we revised, right? And ultimately scored it. You tell me, till I finish talking about 80,000 points, do you have courage to journey with me? Maybe you'll get seat by then.
Yeah.
But you can tell your juniors or anybody. A lot of people say, "Sir, मुझे बहुत tension आ रहा है, anxiety आ रहा है. I feel that my preparation is not adequate." See, every entrance aspirant suffers the same problem of a puerperal woman. Maybe my baby has congenital anomalies. Maybe he is going to die in sleep due to sleep apnea, etc. So there is no need of any such thing. Entrance is preparation is a no-brainer. दिमाग का जरूरत ही नहीं है ये सब समझने के लिए कुछ do you need a big brain? No. Is it a rocket science? Are you creating interballistic missiles? Are you doing any physics calculations? Nothing. Bakwas. But don't read the stuff. See, if you say no, I love to read Harrison for knowledge. I need to read obstetrics, gynecology, Williams for knowledge. Entrance preparation has nothing to do with knowledge. Right? If you say that I want to read 18 hours a day and become very knowledgeable in all 19 subjects, it is trying to fall in love with a prostitute. Right? You are not supposed to fall in love with a paid sex. Right? So, to be obsessed with that coaching material is better, इसका xerox करेंगे, उसका xerox करेंगे, ये book बड़ा मोटा है, मोटा बोले तो और ज़्यादा content है, if more content, life is more miserable, baggage must be lighter, right? So that is very, very important. Yeah. So, S1 is louder if diastole is shortened due to anything that shortens the diastole will make it louder. Anything that delays the diastole, because valves already came closer to each other, right? So anemia, anxiety, fever, all these fibrodynamic conditions, tachycardia. If there is a tachycardia, you can shorten the diastolic filling time. So shorten the diastole means by the time the closure is happening, they are very wide apart, and that will typically lead to louder S1. And any condition that is increasing the flow across the valve also lead to development of a loud S1. That is AV fistula, thyrotoxicosis, very pregnancy, anemia, they are all the things responsible. Similarly, any left to right shunt, that means the right side, right atrium is receiving the regular blood and also the blood from the left side. So overall blood flow across the valve became increased, and that led to development of a louder S1 as in the ASD and PDK. And typically, whenever there is any mitral stenosis or tricuspid stenosis, right? So what will happen in mitral stenosis and tricuspid stenosis? In both the conditions, the pressure crossover occur earlier. That leads to the development of loud S1, right? Unless the valves are calcified. If it is a chronic MS or chronic TS. Okay. Now, similarly, any short PR interval, there is a high velocity of the valve closure leading to loud S1. Just like prolonged PR interval lead to softening of S1, shorter PR interval lead to louder S1 is what you need to basically remember. So that is a quick summary of the first 50 points. He will give you one nice quiz. Take a quiz for about 10 minutes quiz. Can you start the quiz? Yeah. ఒక లింక్ ఇస్తారు మీకు మీరు ఆ లింక్ ఓపెన్ చేసి దాంట్లో నుంచి ఆన్సర్ చేయొచ్చు. Give them the link so that it is a voice rest for me also.
Yes, sir.
All right, even online students can go to the quiz link, because every 1 hour we will take a break, take a quiz, and then we proceed. మీరు ఎక్కడుంటారు డాక్టర్ గారు? దగ్గరే. ఓకే, గుడ్. లింక్ ఇచ్చారా?
Sir, can we review it? Which question we went from? Can we review this quiz? Can we review this quiz again?
We can. We can analyze that. So, welcome back everyone, and am I audible on the online? Please check that. So we are at which, what is the run rate? 50th point?
Yes.
Okay. Koncham volume koncham chinadi. Now, continuing our discussion, very good, we got a very good compliment online. Honestly, I did not know how I missed Murli sir classes in my UG being a Usmania student. Thank you, at least now I'm back. Good. Better. Because we become great teachers only when great students come to class, right? So I promise that I personally sit every day, author about 500 to 600 points, and our DTP team become ready to create the printout and the PDF. So in the next 100 days, I'm going to create the 80,000 point base, and every Sunday we will revise as many as we can. Maybe this Sunday we will have a couple of hours more and make it a half day first day. But if you are ready to come, I am ready to do a midweek class also.
Yes,
So, and this reading room is always available for you. You can come happily sit and study. Air conditioning, everything is available. You can also invite your friends to make it a humble. So, now continuing our discussion, we are here only, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Really? Okay. Now, single S2. Normally, A2 will be heard first, P2 will be later. Why? Because for the closing of the valve, what is needed? A pressure gradient between one chamber and the other chamber should be there for the closure. If you look at the left ventricle versus aorta, right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, if you take the combination, left ventricle operates at 120 by 80 pressure, whereas right ventricle is around 15 to 20 millimeters of mercury during the peak of systole, right ventricle. So that is the reason the pressure is very high at left side. Obviously, the left-sided valve closure will be faster. So A2 will be before the P2 is what you need to remember. So when will you listen to the single S2? When the A2 become delayed, comes closer to the P2, it is less than 30 seconds. They both merge with one another. So that is responsible for the single S2. So whenever the duration between the two is less than 30 milliseconds is what you need to remember. So what are the conditions that delay the aortic closure and responsible for creating a single S2. Let us look into that. Any delayed activation of the left ventricle. So obviously from SA node to AV node, from AV node, the bundle of His will go left and right side. So left bundle, right bundle. So any left bundle branch block will make the left ventricle activation. How will left ventricle activation occur if the left bundle branch is blocked? The right bundle will finish its activation of the right ventricle and then comes and activates the left ventricle. Right? So that is the reason any left bundle branch block will cause the delay of the closure of the aortic valve and lead to single second heart sound is what you need to remember. Similarly, any right ventricular ectopic beat. So that means normally right ventricle, for it to undergo activation, it has to wait for the signal to come from SA node to AV node to AV node to bundle to ventricle. But if ectopic focus is there, then right ventricle will get activated faster and it comes much early, right? So any delayed activation of the left ventricle or a complete or a right ventricular ectopic beat, or if you have done any pacing of the heart, where you kept the pacemaker and paced the right ventricle, that also can cause A2 and P2 come closer, because the delayed A2 or early P2 and both of them merge together to form a single S2 is what you need to remember. So, complete LVBB, any left ventricle outflow tract obstruction or any hypertensive cardiovascular disease. Suppose if left ventricle has to pump against a very high pressure in the root of aorta, it will become delayed by the time it finishes the job and aortic valve closes. And that make A2P to come closer, and that lead to development of the single S2 is what you need to remember. So you should remember what are 7 to 8 causes leading to the single S2. Any delayed A2, early P2 will lead is what you need to remember. Once more. Any decreased impedance of the systemic vascular bed. So now let's talk about what is the meaning of decreased impedance of the systemic vascular bed. So basically, what is the job of the left ventricle? Left ventricle is supposed to vomit into aorta. Suppose if there is any aortic stenosis, right? Or if there is any aortic regurgitation, what will happen? There is aortic stenosis. So that stenotic valve, left ventricle will take a longer time to push the blood. That means hangover time is longer. Aortic regurgitation. Left ventricle pumped the blood into the aorta, and that blood came back, and once more it needs to pump the blood. It is like studying medicine, forgetting medicine. Studying medicine, forgetting medicine. So any aortic regurgitation, aortic stenosis, that all will make the job of the left ventricle become delayed. So just like you have a long OP in the hospital, your hangout time in the OPD will be longer, and your A2 is delayed, right? So that's the point. Similarly, patent ductus arteriosus. So what happens in patent ductus arteriosus if it is there? Patent ductus arteriosus is connecting aorta with pulmonary trunk. So from the pulmonary trunk, what is happening to the blood? From pulmonary artery, it's going to lung to pulmonary vein, right? pulmonary vein. From pulmonary vein, it is coming back to left atrium and quickly coming back to left ventricle. Once more. If the PDA is there, from left ventricle into aorta, aorta into PDA, PDA into pulmonary artery into pulmonary vein into left atrium into back into left ventricle. So what will left ventricle will do? Hey, I pushed the blood into the aorta, it will think. But all that it pushed into aorta is coming back and rejoining it quickly. So left ventricle hangout time will become longer. And that also lead to the single S2 is what you need to remember. Similarly, any severe AS or severe PS, suppose there is a severe PS, pulmonic stenosis, you can't listen the pulmonic valves closure sound at all. What you listen is only the aortic valve closure sound. So that leads to development of single S2. Then what is the reason in severe AS for the single S2? Severe AS will cause left ventricle hangout time increase, and that will make A2 get delayed and match with P2, and that leads to development of single S2. Any severe cough. So what is tetralogy of Fallot? In tetralogy of Fallot, you have a VSD, you have a pulmonic stenosis, you have an overriding aorta, which is opening the mouth into both the right ventricle and also into the left ventricle. Right? And also there is a pulmonic stenosis. So between overriding aorta, VSD, right ventricular hypertrophy, pulmonic stenosis, which one will decide the severity of the cough? Very good. It is the pulmonic stenosis that decides the severity of the tetralogy of Fallot. So if there is a severe cough, there is a severe PS. If there is a severe PS, pulmonic sound is not heard. If the pulmonic sound is not heard, what you listen is only aortic sound, and that is the reason. Doctor, what happens because of that reason? You listen only single S2. Alright? Then tricuspid atresia. Tricuspid atresia. If there is any tricuspid atresia, what will happen? How will a person survive? If there is a tricuspid atresia, how will a person survive? The right atrial blood cannot go into right ventricle simply like that. ASD should be kept open. And because of that, what happened? Right blood has gone into through ASD into left atrium. So left atrium receiving regular blood and also the blood from right atrium. Both the blood is going into left ventricle. So left ventricle has more blood to pump into aorta. That is increasing the hangout time. And that leads to delay of the A2. That mixes with P2. That leads to single heart sound. Right? General medicine is all analysis. Right? You should swing and enjoy. If you try to hard code it and use mnemonic, bimonic and all that and try to master, you're gone. Alright? Then Eisenmenger syndrome. So what is Eisenmenger syndrome? Eisenmenger syndrome is the development of pulmonary hypertension, because of which a left to right shunt became a right to left shunt. Eisenmenger syndrome is once pulmonary hypertension, normally ASD, VSD, PDA. In all the three, normally are they cyanotic or acyanotic? They're all acyanotic. There will be no cyanosis if there is a ASD, VSD or PDA. Why, doctor? Because if there is a ASD, VSD, PDA, ASD is connecting left atrium to right atrium, VSD is connecting left ventricle to right ventricle, and PDA is connecting aorta and pulmonary artery. Always the left-sided pressures are higher than right-sided pressures. And because of that, what happened? Left to right shunt occur. Left is oxygenated blood is mixing with a deoxygenated blood. If good boy meets bad boy, nothing will happen. But if a bad boy meets a good girl, pregnancy will happen. Right? So, right to left is cyanotic, left to right is acyanotic. So, ASD, DSD, PDA, they're all left to right. They're all good meeting bad. They're all good meeting bad. And that is all acyanotic. The moment pulmonary hypertension develops, high pulmonary arterial pressure develops, that lead to high pressure in the right ventricle, because right ventricle has to pump against the high pressure in the pulmonary artery, and a high pressure in the right ventricle will cause the right sided pressures also to increase and overcome the left side pressure, and shunt instead of left to right will become right to left, and that lead to cyanosis. So the development of the cyanosis and the conversion of the left to right shunt to a right to left shunt because of the development of the pulmonary hypertension is called Eisenmenger syndrome, is what you need to basically remember, doctor. Maza aa gaya? So because of the Eisenmenger syndrome, what happened? Because of the Eisenmenger syndrome, the right blood is going to left side and left ventricle is having more blood and hangout time is more, and A2 became delayed and it went and mixed with P2, and that is the reason you listen single second heart. Got it? Then second heart sound, whenever normally second heart sound has a split, A to come first, P to come later. Agree? So what happens during inspiration? Inspiration brings more venous return, because inspiration is what? Negative intrathoracic pressure. That brings more venous return, and that increased venous return is reaching right atrium. That is reaching right ventricle. So that is typically causing more blood on right side, and that will make the right sided hangover time longer. So P2 become longer, delayed. So A to P2 gap become wider. So split become wider. So during inspiration, a normal split become splitter, wider. That is normal. And obviously expiration, what should happen? Opposite. A split should become narrow during expiration, wider become, it should become wider in inspiration. But if the splitting is wide, you are able to listen split during the expiration. Don't you think it is abnormal? Yes. So any audible splitting of the second heart sound during the expiration is considered to be abnormal, is what you need to remember. Whereas the presence of any audible splitting during the inspiration is considered to be physiological. Very good. Now, typically, normally during expiration, how much split is supposed to be there? Split is there, but it's not wide. So, less than 30 milliseconds. And during the inspiration, that become wider, right? So 30 milliseconds is the expected normal split during expiration, which become little more wider during inspiration. But if it is wider than 30 milliseconds, even during expiration, that is abnormal. Agree? Now, so wide physiological splitting, why will it occur?
During expiration,
It is either due to delayed P2 or early A2. Normally A2, P2 responsible for split. Anything that delays the P2 or makes the A2 become early lead to wide physiological splitting. Then what is the meaning of reversible splitting? If the delay of the what is meant by reversible splitting? So normally splitting is because of what? A2 first, P2 later. And widening is because of? Why does it happen widen? A2 became a little early or P2 became delayed will make it wider. Till then you understood. Reversible splitting means if the P2 became early, so early that in fact it happened before A2. Right? And A2 got delayed that it went beyond P2. Beyond P2. Then you will listen the split during expiration also. Then that is called reversible splitting. A widened physiological splitting will not be heard during expiration. It is inspiration only, normal wide become wider. That is okay. But if become reversed, then not only inspiration, you listen the split during expiration. So listening to the split even during expiration is abnormal, and typically it happens if there is a delayed A2 or very early P2. And what is meant by widened physiological splitting? Widened physiological splitting is normally A2 then P2. If the A2 is very early or P2 is very delayed, then it becomes more wider. But widened splitting is heard only during inspiration, not during expiration. But reversible splitting is heard during expiration and inspiration also. Understand? That is what we need to have clarity. So wide physiological splitting is due to a delayed pulmonic closure or a early aortic valve closure. And reversible splitting is due to delayed A2 or early P2. Chalo. The remaining thing is all gain. What lead to delayed pulmonic closure? Obviously, activation of the right ventricle if it is delayed. Then P2 become delayed. So any right bundle branch blocked, right? Then what makes a early A2? Early A2. If the left ventricle is spaced bit, or if it is a left ventricle ectopic bit, any of them can make early, and that lead to development of wide physiological splitting is what you need to remember. Then what is the cause for the wide physiological splitting? Because the delayed pulmonary closure, it can also occur whenever there is any prolonged right ventricular systole. The right ventricular systole got prolonged. When will that happen? If the right ventricle is undergoing systole and pushing blood into pulmonary artery, if there is any massive pulmonary embolus, then pulmonary resistance is very high. Then left ventricle has to pump a longer period of time. That also will delay the P2. Any delay of the P2 will lead to reversible splitting or physiological widening. Physiological widening. So any massive pulmonary embolism, pulmonary hypertension, or any pulmonic stenosis, any of them will cause the delaying of the right ventricular systolic activity, and that lead to the delay of the pulmonic valve closure, and that lead to the development of a wide physiological splitting. Then any increased hangout on the right side, just like earlier we discussed, just reverse of that. So any decreased impedance of the pulmonary vascular bed with an increased hangout time, or any more blood on the right side, all these things will delay the P2. So ASD, or any pulmonary artery dilatation or pulmonary stenosis, any of them will cause more amount of hangout on the right side. Right side activity. That leads to development of the delay of the P2. So that is all the story about the split story. Now, doctor, soft S1. Already we discussed this. Soft S1 is because of a decreased rate in the pressure crossover. The left ventricle has to build pressure more than the atrium for closure to happen. So, if that left ventricle pressure building is taking longer, then that leads to soft S1. That typically happens in mitral regurgitation. Just before we discussed. Yeah. Now, wide physiological splitting can occur because of delayed P2 or early aortic valve closure. So, what leads to early aortic valve closure? Early aortic valve closure if there is a MR or VSD. Why? Left ventricle is pumping into aorta. 100 ml it is supposed to pump into aorta across the aortic valve. That has some hangout time. Suppose if you have MR means memory loss. So left ventricle is like a NEET PG aspirant studying it. Output instead of going forward, something it is forgetting into MR. Right? So what will happen? Let us say 100 ml blood, it will take 100 seconds to push. Right? So 100 ml blood, by the time 60 ml is forward pushed, 40 ml has gone into the atrium in reverse way. So the job is over. Then there is an early closure of aortic valve. Understand? So MR, which is spilling the blood back and decreasing the hangout time, and the job is over early, will make the aortic valve to close the door, go home. Right? That lead to wide physiological splitting because of early aortic valve closure. Same thing VSD. VSD, the flow is from left ventricle to right ventricle to left ventricle. VSD. If there is a ventricular septal defined, the blood is flowing from left ventricle into right ventricle. When is it flowing from left ventricle to right ventricle? When the ventricle is undergoing systole. So when the ventricle is undergoing systole, some blood is moving into aorta and some blood is leaking into right ventricle, so that the ventricle became empty earlier and aortic valve closure also is earlier, and that leads to development of wide physiological splitting. A to P2 gap become wider. You'll remember, right? But in exam hall, you can't make all this logic. Like a reflex, hot samosa, you have to finish. So that's the reason you should understand logically. What is the big deal? If you know right chambers are on right side, left chambers are left side, you know everything in cardiology. No big deal about it. No rocket science. Then reversed physiological splitting is due to delayed aortic valve closure, and that is because of LVBB, right ventricular pace beat or right ventricular ectopic beat. Already we discussed this. Then longer hangout time. I think this point also we discussed. Yeah. PDA, aortic stenosis, aortic regurgitation, ASD, in all these scenarios, typically there is a delayed closure. Then, PDA I already explained you. PDA will bring the blood pumped by the left ventricle into the aorta, quickly come back to the left atrium and back into the left ventricle. And that will increase the hangout time. Now, reverse physiological splitting can occur because of the early pulmonic valve closure or delayed aortic valve closure. This you all remember and agree, right? Very good. So, what lead to early pulmonic valve closure? Anything that makes the right ventricle get activated early will make pulmonic valve also to close early. So what is Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome? So normally what should happen? SA node to AV node to bundle of his, and activation should spread directly between atria ventricle if there is any connection. Then ventricle did not wait for AV node bundle to give it. It will directly receive it and undergo activation. So there are two types of WPW syndrome, type A, type B. Type A means between left atrium to left ventricle. Type B means if that abnormal path is between right atrium to right ventricle. So if there is a right atrium to right ventricle abnormal path, Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome type B, then that typically lead to right ventricle to get early activated, P2 to close very early, and A2, P2 become reversed, right? So that is, tomorrow examiner will simply ask a question. Reverse splitting is seen in which type of Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome?
Type B.
10 times you say type B, type A, type B, type A, batti baare to maza nahi hai. If you know the logic, you know. Still there is something to batti here. What is that? Type A is between left atrium to, and right is on the
Type B.
Type B. That you need to remember. No one can help you. Okay? Easy to remember. How? Left, right, left, right, left, right, we say. A, B, A, B, A, B. So left is A. Left atrium to left ventricle in Wolff-Parkinson is type A. Right is type B. That's, I mean, some dance we have to do to remember. Now, fixed split. Let's talk about it. So what do you mean by wide fixed split? Wide fixed split. First of all, it is wide split. What do you mean by wide split? When you are taking inspiration, A to P2 split become wide. That is P2 is delayed, A2 is early, P2 is delayed. So there is a wide split. Let us take ASD. First of all, ASD में wide split क्यों होता है? In ASD, how is the shunt happening? Left to right or right to left? Left to right. So the right atrium is receiving regular blood from SVC, IVC. It is also receiving the blood from left atrium. So all that more blood received by right atrium is going to right ventricle. So the P2 become delayed. So A to P2 gap become wider. So wide splitting is happening in ASD. What is the meaning of fixed then? Fixed means normally during inspiration what is happening? A to P2 gap is increasing. During inspiration, A to P2 gap is increasing. So now the person took inspiration, the ASD patient took inspiration. Negative intrathoracic pressure is there. So the blood is sucked from great veins. Now we want to pump all that sucked blood into right atrium. Then what will right atrium will say? Oh my God, are you joking? This is second pregnancy. Oh my God, I can't take this anymore. First itself is too much. I thought of having half baby, right? So gone are the days. Go and talk to your grandmother. She agreed for 5-6 pregnancies, not me. No, no, no. Right? Talk to my lawyer. So the right atrium will tell, oh my God, inspiration. You want to give me more blood? How can I take more blood, man? Already this stupid left atrium left all the kids to me. Right atrium will say, all the left atrium mar gaya. It has sent through ASD all that extra blood into right atrium already. Already my pressures are high. Where will I take some extra blood from you? Just because you have done an inspiration, negative thoracic pressure and want to bring more blood, I'm not ready to take. So that is the reason there is a wide split. Because of the left atrial blood excessively coming into the right side, there is a wide split. But no further widening at the time of inspiration. That's the reason it is called fixed wide. That means it is fixed because with inspiration there is no further widening. That is what you need to emphatically remember. So, Dr. ASD, pulmonary stenosis, acute right heart failure, in all these scenarios, similar thing happen wide, but it is fixed. But wide fixed split is most characteristic means ASD. Most characteristic means ASD. So if you look at the normal split, you listen the split only during inspiration. Right? If it is a narrow split, right? Typically there is a pulmonary arterial hypertension, right? Pulmonary arterial hypertension, what will happen? The high pressure in the pulmonary artery will kick the pulmonic valve very fast. So P2 closure occur early. So the split become narrow. So both a narrow split and normal split, they both are heard during only inspiration. Only inspiration. Agreed? Then both inspiratory and expiratory is wide split or wide fixed split. But only expiratory, no inspiratory is reversed split or paradoxical split. Okay? So these are the 3 points you remember. So wide split, wide fixed split is typically both inspiratory and expiratory, but only expiratory is reversed split, paradoxical. And narrow split and normal split is heard only during inspiration, not during expiration. Agree? This much you are clear? Very good, very good, very good. So please remember, examiner tomorrow's exam is going to ask you, where do you listen paradoxical split? Classical LBBB. Where do you hear wide split? And which condition? RBBB. Wide fixed split? ASD. And narrow split? PSH. And normal split, anyway you know. So this is what you have to remember, doctor. Now, continuing our discussion. S3 is a low frequency sound, high amplitude sound heard with the bell. S3 is a diastolic heart sound. So diastolic means it occurs after S2. And S3 occurs during the rapid filling of the ventricles during the early to mid part of the diastolic. And where do you listen S3? S3 is heard in the apex when the patient is in the left lateral decubitus position. That's what you need to basically remember. Then, what is the other name given for the third heart sound? Ventricular gallow, diastolic gallow, pericardial knock is also a diastolic sound which is similar to S3. constrictive pericarditis, you get pericardial knock. It is a type of S3. Then, can you see S3 physiologically? Yes, sir. Any high cardiac output, like athletes, fever, pregnancy, paradoxus, AV fistula. Why do you see physiological S3 if there is any pregnancy, fever, or anything? Just before we discuss, what is the meaning of S3? When the left ventricle fails, end of the systole, it is unable to pump all the blood. So a lot of pool of blood is remaining. So after the systole, when the early to mid diastole is there, when the blood is jumping, it is jumping into a pool of stagnant blood. So if there is any pregnancy, the plasma volume will increase. The amount of the blood reaching to the heart itself is increased. And even though the heart did not fail, it pumped, still end of the pumping, a stagnant pool is left in the ventricle because of the very high volume of the plasma. And that is the reason when the blood jumps, it makes sound. So physiologically only you may find S3 in pregnancy. Got it? Then pathological S3 is an indication of ventricular dysfunction and a poor systolic function, right? And because of poor systolic function, what happened? End of the systole, it is unable to pump the blood, end systolic volume is high. And because of that, there is a high filling pressure and splashing sound. Then, what are all the conditions where you see pathological S3? Whenever the heart is failing, either due to ischemia or cardiomyopathy or valvular heart disease or systemic hypertension, anything that fails the heart leads to the development of S3 is what you need to remember. And any condition which is hyperkinetic, like anemia, paradoxus, AV fistula, very VSD, PDA, anything that is increasing the volume inside the heart will create that splashing sound where you find pathological S3. Pathological S3 can also be seen in restrictive cardiomyopathy, any pericardial disease, constrictive pericarditis. And in the pathological S3 that you listen in the constrictive pericarditis is also called pericardial knock. So pericardial knock fundamentally is a diastolic sound or systolic sound, doctor? It is a diastolic sound. Just like S3 is a diastolic sound. S3 is a mid-diastolic and early diastolic, or is it late diastolic? It is early to mid. S4 is late diastolic when atria is contracting against a stiff ventricle. Alright? Then pathological third heart sound, right, is associated with constrictive pericarditis. Then the pericardial knock that you listen in the constrictive pericarditis is nothing but a third heart sound. So the pericardial knock is same as S3. So it should be diastolic or systolic? Diastolic. That means it should be before A2 or after A2? Diastole is between S1 and S2, no? So that is the reason. Sorry. Diastole is between S1 S2 or S2 S1? S2 vertical closes. Then the ventricle starts filling, no? So that is the reason it should be after S2. Right? So after A2, after 0.1 to 0.2 seconds, you listen the pericardial knock because it is similar to S3 is what you need to remember. And congenital heart diseases, like ASD, VSD, PDA, they all can lead to development of the failure of the heart leading to loud S3. Now what is the cause of the fourth heart sound? Fourth heart sound typically happens because the atrium during the last one-third of the ventricular diastole is trying to push the blood against a stiff ventricle. Anything that decreases the compliance of the ventricle, because of hypertrophy of the ventricle or a restrictive infiltrative disease into the ventricle, if something infiltrates into ventricle like amyloid, that makes ventricle become stiff. Into that you have to push blood, means you listen S4. That's what you need to basically remember. So fourth heart sound is heard typically during the last one-third of the diastole and just before the systole. That's the reason fourth heart sound is also called pre-systolic heart sound, is what you have to emphatically remember. What kind of sound is fourth heart sound? It's low pitched, means high amplitude, means you require the bell. It is typically 20 cycles or less, and it is not generally audible. And to listen that you require the bell, that's what you need to remember. And where do you listen? Left ventricular apex, and typically the left lateral position. Then, if the person does isometric exercises in the supine position, what will happen? When you do an isometric exercise in supine position, your peripheral vascular resistance will increase because you produce catecholamines, vasoconstriction. Peripheral vascular resistance increase. Agree? So when peripheral vascular resistance increase, right? What's happening? Peripheral vascular resistance increase. So on one side your ventricle is stiff. On the top of it your outside the ventricle also is very tight. Then atria need more blowing power. So that is the reason S4 become more audible. So if you want to really listen in a hypertensive individual with a hypertrophic heart, make him to do a couple of isometric exercises. If he can, see that he doesn't go into CHF, right? And you don't tell Dr. Murli Bharadwaj asked us to do this. Like, vicarious liability will be on me. We'll discuss in forensic. So in forensic medicine, there are totally around 2000 points. Sharp, bullet-like points. They'll not have this much reasoning, but we need to go together through that journey. Then it becomes interesting. Now, anything that makes ventricle hypertrophic, decrease the compliance, it can be because of any MI, old MI, any ventricular aneurysm, or pulmonary hypertension, systemic hypertension, anything can lead to development of a pathological fourth heart sound. So easy for you to remember. A failed ventricle is S3. A struggling atrium against a non-compliant ventricle is S4. S4 is called atrial gallop. S3 is called ventricular gallop, is what you need to remember. Once more. A pathological fourth heart sound can also be heard whenever there is any excessive late diastolic filling. So that can happen with anemia, thyrotoxicosis, or vigorous atrial systole. Anything can lead to development of pathological fourth heart sound. Similarly, any heart block. So obviously, if there is a heart block, why do you hear pathological fourth heart sound? Because normally, if there is no heart block, SA node to AV node to ventricles, ventricles contract, atria relax, atria contract, ventricles relax, everything is in synchrony. Right? Husband angry, shouting, wife is listening. Wife is angry in the kitchen in the morning, husband is listening. That all happens if there is a nice SA note to AV note to bundle of his seamless flow. But suddenly father-in-law, mother-in-law came. They are like a hard block. So earlier when husband is shouting, wife used to be silent. This time because her mummy and daddy is there, she is also shouting. Both of them are shouting. You listen pathological S4. So pathological S4 happens whenever that atrioventricular synchrony is gone, is what you need to remember. That makes the atrial systole become harder. When atria is undergoing contraction during last one-third of the ventricular diastole, ventricle is supposed to be in relaxed state. But if there is a AV block, then it is not in a, it is in its own synchrony. And then atria has to, just like canon A wave, same funda also applies over here, is what you need to remember. Once you are aging, your ventricles are getting hypertrophic. And that also can make physiological S4 in aging person. Need not be pathological. So what are all the diastolic sounds that you know? S3, diastolic or systolic? Diastolic. S4, diastolic. Pericardial knock, diastolic. Then similarly, in atrial myxoma, you listen a sound called tumor clog. When does it happen? When the atrium is trying, left atrium is trying to drain into left ventricle and ventricle is undergoing diastole, this tumor will come, create a turbulence and create a plop. So that is the reason tumor plop also occurs during the ventricular diastole. That's what you need to basically remember. All right. Now, what are the various systolic sounds that you know? And anyway, opening snap is also diastolic sound. So typically, if there is a mitral stenosis, when the mitral valve opens, when will mitral valve open? When the ventricle is getting filled from atria. So that is the reason opening snap is also a diastolic sound. That's what you need to remember. Then, what are the systolic sounds? Systolic, when the ventricle is in systolic. So you have something called clicks, ejection clicks, mid-systolic click. So they are all systolic sounds. I'll talk about this clicks. Where do you listen click? Very simple. If there is any aortic stenosis, aortic valve stenosis. So whenever there is any aortic valve stenosis, ventricle, when it is undergoing systole and trying to push the blood into aorta, what it should do first? It should open the aortic valve and push the blood. So for that, what it did, it raised the pressure and said, come on, sim kulja, aortic valve open. But aortic valve is stenotic. And under the aortic valve, ventricle is building pressure. Because of that, aortic valve become ballooned and create that musical sound, which is called click. So when will the click will be heard? During the systole, early part of the systole. When the systole is about to begin. That's the reason it's called an ejection systolic click, which is the early part of the systole. Whenever there is a stenotic valvular lesion of the aortic valve or pulmonic valve is what you need to remember. So what is the importance of click? So if you look at aortic stenosis, the stenosis can be subvalvular, valvular or supravalvular. Tell me a syndrome where you have supravalvular aortic valve stenosis. Williams syndrome. You have supravalvular stenosis, right? And subvalvular obstruction, where do you get? Below the aortic valve in the left ventricular outflow tract, where did you get the obstruction? Just before we discussed HOCM. So HOCM is a subvalvular obstruction. Williams syndrome is a supravalvular obstruction. And rheumatic heart disease associated valvular stenosis is a valvular level obstruction. And where do you listen the click? Click is that musical sound because of the ballooning of the valve. Only valvular stenosis, valvular aortic obstruction. If the aortic stenosis is valvular, not subvalvular or supravalvular, then only you listen the click. That is the importance of click. So click, ejection click is a systolic sound. Understand? Then in the middle of the systole you get the click. In the mitral valve collapse. Now let us debate why does it happen. Actually, I don't have whiteboard. If I have whiteboard, I can actually articulate better. So, what's happening in MVP, mitral valve collapse? When the ventricle is undergoing systole and trying to push the blood into aorta, this high pressure in the left ventricle is causing the mitral valve to collapse into atrium, and that is suddenly causing the stretching of chordae tendineae. And that is the reason you are listening that musical sound, which is called mid-systolic click of the MVP. Unlike the aortic and pulmonic stenosis lead to ejection systolic click is what you need to basically remember. So, ejection click is fundamentally what type of click? Systolic click. Systolic means it should be heard after S1 or S2? After S1 your systole begins. So always ejection click is a added heart sound heard after S1. Then fourth heart sound is diastolic. So it is pre-systolic. So that is the reason it is before the S1. Between S1 and S2, it is mid-systolic. Typically, you listen to the mid-systolic click of mitral valve collapse, MVP, right? Then after S2 means diastolic. So what are the things that you listen in diastole? S3, S4, opening snap, pericardial knock, tumor plop, they are all diastolic. Then how do you describe a ejection click? Ejection click is sharp. Ejection click is high pitched, and it is audible during early systole, right? Immediately after S1. That is what you need to remember. Then what are all the conditions where you see ejection click? Any valvular pathology, stenotic lesion, like aortic stenosis, pulmonary stenosis, hypertension, any of them can lead to the production of ejection click. Whenever left ventricle is producing a lot of pressure underneath the valve will undergo ballooning. That can lead to click. Understood? In ASPS. Why in hypertension? Even in hypertension, left ventricle has to use a lot of pressure to push the blood into aorta. That also can cause the ballooning of a normal aortic valve also. That's the reason even hypertension also ejection click can be heard, is what you have to remember. Then how do you describe opening snap? Opening snap is a brief, high-pitched, low amplitude. Right? That means you have to listen with diaphragm. Early diastole, the moment mitral valve opens. Typically, when do you call diastole? After S2 or after S1? After S2. Agreed? Agreed? Systole after S1, diastole after S2. Systole after S1, diastole after S2. Okay? in the mid of the night, REM sleep also, you should be uttering them until entrance. After that, if you become skin doctor, you don't need it. If you become skin doctor, you will be looking for how many bald heads are there, how many acne females are there, huh? How many people are getting married. Nowadays, they are also giving marriage package for cleaning the face. Huh? Bridal, there is not much of difference between a salon and a dermatologist work. Huh? So, but before you join dermatology, where is S1, where is S2, where is S3, you have to, right? But it's enjoyable. If you understood logic, cardiology, neurology, any logic will be done. Next, opening snap typically is heard after A2. Now, what is the importance of the gap between A2 and OS? Normally, it is between 0.04 to 0.12 seconds. Suppose after S2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 0.12 seconds should pass for you to listen the opening snap. But if it occurred early, between A2 and OS, it occurred early. Does it mean mitral stenosis is more severe or less severe?
More severe.
Why? Mitral stenosis is more severe. If it is more severe, what will happen to the atrial pressure? Atrial pressure. If it is more severe, atrium, if 100 ml blood is received from IVC, SVC, it is unable to pump all that blood because of stenosis. It is given a very little time. So some blood remained in atrium and it received the regular venous return. So together it has got more blood, more pressure. So the moment A2, that means aortic valve closes, ventricle relaxes, high pressure in the atrium will open. And that opening happens faster. So between the A2 and the OS, the gap becomes lesser. Understood? Once more, I'll summarize for you quickly. More severe, what is the argument we are having an argument here? What is the importance of A2 OS gap and relation to mitral stenosis severity? उसके बारे में अध्यक्ष महोदय अभी चर्चा हो रहा है मंच पे. So A2 is the closure of the aortic valve and the end of the ventricular systole. Then ventricular undergoes relaxation. Pressure in the left ventricle fell down. Let us say if the MS is severe, then the amount of pressure building behind the mitral valve in the atrium is higher. And with that high pressure inside it, it was just waiting. When will A2 happen? When will aortic valve close and ventricle relaxes? Then I want to push the blood. The moment A2 happens, ventricle relaxes, the pressure is down in the ventricle, already aorta, already left atrium with full of pressure inside it, will open the mitral valve and push the blood into ventricle. And opening snap is heard. So, narrower the A2OS gap, more severe is mitral stenosis. That is what you need to remember. So, where do you see opening snap? Whenever AV valves are stenotic, like mitral stenosis or in tricuspid stenosis. Then how do you describe tumor plop? Tumor plop is a low pitched sound. That means it is low pitch, high amplitude. That means you have to listen with bell. So opening snap is with diaphragm. Tell me what are all the diastolic sounds that you know? Opening snap, S3, S4, and tumor plop. So tumor plop is heard with bell, low pitched. S3 is bell, low pitched. S4 is bell, low pitched. But opening snap is high pitched, low amplitude. Hence, you have to use diaphragm. That is what you have to be very, very clear about. Now, what conditions lead to tumor plop? Atrial myxoma. Atrial myxoma-like conditions which create an obstruction to the flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle will create the tumor plop during the ventricular diastole. Then opening snap is brief, high-pitched sound heard in the early diastole, whereas ejection sounds are all heard during systole. Then opening snap, where do you hear? Typically in the lower left sternal border, and it radiates towards the base of the heart. Base apex are there, no? So it radiates towards the base of the heart. And opening snap is what type of sound? High pitched or low pitched? High pitched sound. And your respiratory sounds are also high pitched. That is the reason it is best to heard during expiration when your lungs are at rest. They don't disturb you. And the A to OS gap is inversely related to severity. Shorter the gap, greater the severity. Greater the gap, lesser the severity. And OS, opening snap is followed by what? In mitral stenosis, once opening happened, then the blood is moving from atria into ventricle through a stenotic valve. That leads to development of murmur of mitral stenosis. Okay, so the mitral stenosis murmur is a diastolic murmur or systolic murmur? Diastolic. That too mid-diastolic murmur. And what type of mid-diastolic murmur it is? Is it high pitched or low pitched? It is low pitched, high amplitude. So you have to use bell. To listen opening snap, you have to use diaphragm. But to listen mid-diastolic rumble, you need to listen through the bell. Right? So what do you listen? Tell me. In mitral stenosis. Hey, we lost screen share. So, what do you listen in mitral stenosis? Lab S1, dub S2. After that, toop, opening snap. After that, drrrr, drrrr. That's a mid-diastolic murmur. It's a rumbling sound. Rumbling. Lab dub drrrr, lab dub drrrr, lab dub drrrr. That is mitral stenosis. Don't tell Murli must teach so crazily, but yeah, I'm one kind of a crazy guy in the world. Be very sure, right? You want to achieve something, you have to be crazy about it, passionate about it. You should not have second thoughts about it, and you should think that if not me, who will win the game? No, shares. Why system audio not required? Just to share screen. Share window. Acha, I think that PowerPoint is gone. Your PowerPoint, yeah, is there, no? Okay. No, you cancel and then once more click on share. not there. Okay, you open and close that PowerPoint. Close and open the PowerPoint. What is slide number? Question number?
108.
Huh?
108.
108. Okay, we already crossed a century. Huh?
Yes.
Good, good.
Slide number 110. Slide number 110.
Not bad. In about 3 hours, no, 2.5 hours, we touched 108. My goal is, at least in 1 day session, we should be able to finish around 700-800 points. Then in 10 days, we will finish general medicine. Nobody will stop you from winning. Yeah. So, all right. Is the voice audible in the online? Check that. Yeah. So, doctor, love, the, is what? Mitral stenosis. So it's a low pitch rumbling diastolic murmur is what you need to remember, right? So good. Then what's the importance of opening snap? If opening snap is there, means there is a valve. There is a valve which has tensile strength to create that popping sound. That means it is not calcified. So that means it is MS is organic. That's the meaning of that. Then also opening snap indicates the cusps are pliable, is what you need to remember. See, once upon a time, they used to boast clinical medicine about history. History, yeah. Inspection and identifying the clinical condition, even if you identify, nobody believes. Look and say, oh, I think you have a mitral stenosis. If you say no, hey, what man are you? Sadhu Sant, they will say. Inspection gone. Then came Narada Tambura. Tum, 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 percussion. Useless trick. It is also jadi boti, bakwas. They thrown it out. Then auscultation. Strength laga, is it MDM, BDM, ADM, EDM? Oh my God. Gone are the days. Right? Today is all churiko. I still remember as a medical student, we were betting on a case of mitral stenosis way back in Gandhi Medical College. On the bike, me and my friend Dr. Gangadhar, he is a top nephrologist now. He is an office on special duty to the CM. So we both were betting about MS, and on our bike we took the patient to Usmania because those days Tudico was not there in Gandhi, right? So golden days of Gandhi. So there one of our senior was doing cardiology DM. He's a top cardiologist by name Dr. Kondallo sir. So he is generous to do 2D and declare, hey, this is pure MS or MS plus MR. Then we used to bring back the patient and drop him back and thank him for having cooperated with us. So those days are gone where you bet in the ward rounds and then carry the patient and all. Today 2D is available bedside. Right? But for entrance, all these things. So opening snap always indicates that there is a high atrioventricular pressure gradient is what you need to remember. So, one more thing about opening snap is if opening snap is there, it means it is MS. A lot of times when there is any conflicting evidence, right? Then comes pan-systolic murmur. What is the meaning of pan-systolic murmur? Lub, dub, lub, dub. That's what we expect to listen. But no lub, no dub, nothing you can hear. Only what you hear is zzz, 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 zzz. Only zzz, zzz, like a honeybee. That is called pan-systolic murmur. If the pan-systolic murmur comes, it will bury S1, it will bury S2, right? And what you listen is only that honeybee like zzz, 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 zzz sound if you put stethoscope. So, where do you see pan-systolic murmur? Pan-systolic murmur typically happen whenever there is any obstruction to a flow is happening throughout the systole. Systole begins after S1 or S2? S1. Right? Huh? Right. So after S1, so you don't listen S1. You only listen murmur. S1 is buried, S2 is buried, and you only listen murmur. So VSD, mitral regurgitation, tricuspid regurgitation. In all these scenarios, the auscultatory obstruction and that the auscultatory phenomenon is happening during systole. It's happening throughout the systole for the obstruction to flow. That's the reason these are the classical examples of pan-systolic murmur, is what you need to remember. Then mid-systolic, ejection systolic murmurs. What do they mean? They start after S1, but they end before S2. So you listen S1, you listen murmur, you listen S2 also.
So it is Lubber and S2.
Huh?
So it is Lubber and
Lubber, murmur,
S2.
S2. Right? Lubber, murmur, S2. That's what you need to remember. So, where do you listen mid-systolic murmur? You listen in aortic stenosis, coarctation of aorta, PDA, pulmonary stenosis, pulmonary hypertension. Anything that is causing the ventricle to struggle to push the blood at the time of the ventricular systole will lead to development of a mid-dot ejection systolic murmur. Typically, valvular pathologies lead to, like aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis lead to ejection systolic murmur. Okay? Then pan-systolic is all MR, PR, VSD, all those things. Then early systolic murmurs begin with first heart sound and end in mid-systolic. Mid-systolic is what we need to remember. So where do we see early systolic murmurs? So VSD typically lead to pan-systolic, but if it is a large VSD with pulmonary hypertension, small muscular VSD, or without pulmonary hypertension, if there is any TR will not be there throughout the systole. TR regurgitation occur only during early part of systole. Whereas MR occur throughout the systole. Regurgitation occur throughout the systole. Right? Then if there is a MR, but if it is a non-compliant left atrium, so you listen a mitral regurgitation after patient get myocardial infarction sometimes. Why? Myocardial infarction sometimes lead to ischemic damage to the papillary muscles, and the papillary muscle dysfunction will make the valve become non-compliant, right? And that lead to the development of a MR acutely created. So even acute murmur is acute MR is not holosystolic. It is early systolic only, is what you need to remember. So this is something that is a part of the story. Before we go to the HOCM, do you like to take another quiz? So that some break of thought. So for me also it is a little break. After that we will have another half an hour, 45 minutes discussion and then call it a day. And if you are ready to come on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, any day, so please talk to our Bhagyalakshmi or whoever connected with you. We will form a group, study group. Slowly we'll start. Some other students are supposed to come because the Ugadi they didn't. So they will come. More also is not merry. Right? More is also a distortion. So feel free that this center we created only for you guys, and until you get you write with a confidence that you are going to win this May only, no problem. So earlier, a lot of Dr. Harini, so many people used to just hang out across the center. We used to have in the third floor. So they used to hang out, and then they're all now top gynecologists and obstetricians. 2 years back, when we closed the center because of the corona, I had to sell away the furniture. So some of the neurosurgeon cardiologists, they all came. Hey, I was sitting here and studying. I will take this table, this thing. Within 1 day, I sold everything like an auction. After 2 years, once more I started. So ultimately, what is important is ecosystem, doctor. Spardhaya Vardate Vidya. Another thing we can do, this center will be open from morning 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Right? And every 1 hour we run a quiz so that silently you can play the quiz also. According to a schedule, we can run the just 20 or 25 questions quiz quickly, rapid fire. So that keeps you active to study. We are also going to put one coffee machine, and we will try to limit the number of people sitting here to around 40 to 50 people, so that it won't be too much of disturbance. And whenever I get time, I come. And there are a lot of my students who are wonderful teachers. We have Dr. Vamshidhar Reddy. He's a cardiothoracic surgeon. He teaches surgery. Then we have Vishal Soni. He's a very good teacher in surgery, right? And Gautam is a cardiothoracic surgeon. Then some of my students, Dr. Shilpa Reddy is a very good gynecology obstetrics teacher. So they love to come and then deliver a session. So no worries. And every day, morning to evening, I work to make around 500-600 points notes ready. It's not yet ready. Whatever that you have is ready. So I like your classmate, I'll prepare, make our people make arrangement of the notes. They'll take a photocopy of that and give you. You can review the notes also. At least medicine, surgery, gynocs. Let us make a comprehensive notes of 8,000 points. Because almost all 40 medicine, 30 surgery, 30 gynocs. 100 marks is gone here only. 50% of your preparation is gone here. If you are able to quickly do the revision of these 25,000 points, then that's a achievement. Some way. And on Saturdays, we'll have a subject test, grant test, and evening a discussion on that. Sure. So please take a test, and I'll rejoin. All right, so welcome back to the discussion. Now we reached a very interesting part of the story called dynamic auscultation of murmurs. To understand this topic, it is very crucial in entrance. Suppose if 40 questions come in general medicine in tomorrow NEET PG. 5 to 6 questions come from cardiology. One will definitely come from dynamic auscultation. That's the reason we should understand. Now, let's talk hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. What the problem is this? There is a hypertrophic interventricular septum. From left atrium to left ventricle, blood came. From left ventricle, it should go into aorta. And this mitral valve leaflet is coming and touching interventricular septum when it is undergoing systolic. You tell me, will this touching between the anterior mitral valve leaflet and the interventricular septum will be more or less if the ventricular size is smaller? When the ventricular size is smaller, will the touching will be more or will it be less? If this ventricle size is smaller, there is a crowding. That's the reason the septum and the leaflet will touch more. But if this ventricular size is more, then this touching will be, if it is more, then they get separated. No? So touching will be less and obstruction will be less. I'll summarize once more. The blood comes from left atrium into left ventricle through the mitral valve. From left ventricle, it has to go into aorta. So while it is going, this path is called left ventricular outflow tract. So this hypertrophic interventricular septum and mitral valve leaflet, they come together closer and that touches and causes obstruction for this flow from left ventricle into aorta. And this is called LVOT obstruction, left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. Anything that makes the left ventricular size become smaller typically will increase the touching, increase the obstruction. Agree? Now, let us start. Valsalva maneuver. What is the meaning of Valsalva maneuver? Valsalva maneuver is basically forced expiration against a closed glottis. Forced expiration against a closed glottis is Valsalva maneuver. So during inspiration, what happened? There is a negative interthoracic pressure, more venous return, more preload came to heart. Obviously, during expiration, there is a positive interthoracic pressure and decreased venous return and decreased preload. Decreased preload to the heart. So when there is a decreased preload to the heart, the filling of left atrium is lesser. The filling of ventricle also is lesser. So the size of the ventricle is smaller. Then the obstruction will be obstruction will be If the ventricle size is smaller, the touching will be more. Obstruction will be more. If this is smaller size, this and this will touch more and this flow will become, obstruction to the flow become more. Summarize. Valsalva maneuver. Valsalva maneuver is opposite to inspiration. Inspiration increases the venous rhythm. Expiration decreases the venous rhythm. If there is a decreased venous rhythm, there is a decreased preload to the heart. If there is a decreased preload to the heart, the left atrium receives less blood. If the left atrium receives less blood, there is a less blood in left ventricle. When the left ventricle has got less blood, the left ventricular size is smaller. If the size of the left ventricle is smaller, the touching between the interventricular septum and the mitral valve leaflet will be more. When that is more, what will happen? Obstruction is more. Murmur will be more. That's what you need to know. You remember? Don't forget. Then, standing. What is the effect of standing? Will standing increase venous return or decrease venous return? All your blood is pulled in the legs. There is a decreased venous return to the heart, decreased preload, smaller size of the chamber, greater amount of touching, greater amount of obstruction. So standing increases. Valsalva maneuver increases the obstruction in HOC. Squatting
normally increases venous
that is opposite to standing. So increased venous return will increase the preload, increased preload will increase the size, increased chamber size of the left ventricle will decrease the touching, decrease the obstruction, and that lead to the development of decreased murmur. Then comes interesting part. Hand grip exercise. If you do hand grip exercise, if you took a hand grip exercise, hand grip exercise will release catecholamines. Catecholamines will cause vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction increases the afterload. Increases the afterload. So afterload means what? It is the pressure inside the aorta. If the pressure inside the aorta is high, reflexively what will ventricle will do? It will use a greater pressure to push the blood. When it is using greater pressure to push the blood, will this touching will matter or will it overcome?
It will overcome.
It overcomes. It doesn't matter. That is the reason the murmur will decrease. This is a little tricky to remember. A lot of people don't know. Summarize. Hand grip mein hota hai release of catecholamines. Release of catecholamines lead to vasoconstriction. That will increase the afterload, and that increased afterload will increase the contractility, and that will overcome the obstruction, and that decreases the obstruction. Barabar? Done? Very good. Then HOC with a left side or a right side phenomena? Left side. So left-sided lesions will not be affected by inspiration. Inspiration will increase the venous return on the right side, and hence it is unaffected. Then, if this ventricle develops a premature ventricular complex, what will happen? If it develops a premature ventricular complex, right, after the premature ventricular complex means there is an abnormal QRS, and so there is an altered electrical depolarization. After the premature ventricular, with the premature ventricular complex, the there is a post PVC increased strength of contraction. Inotropic state of the myocardium will increase, and that will eject more blood, and it will become, because of the ejection of more blood, in the next beat it will become a smaller ventricle, and that will increase the obstruction. Understand? Post PVC, there is increased inotropic state of the ventricle, myocardium, that will eject more amount of blood, creating a smaller ventricle, which leads to the development of a greater obstruction. All right? So, close the eyes and now answer. Squatting, what is the effect of it on HOCM?
Decreases.
Squatting, what will it do?
Decreases.
Decreases the murmur. Standing,
Increases the murmur.
hand grip exercise,
Decreases.
decreases the murmur. Post PVC,
Increases the murmur.
increases the murmur. Got it? Valsalva maneuver,
Increases the murmur.
beautiful. All right? Forever in your life you will not forget. Then comes aortic stenosis. Valsalva maneuver. If there is a Valsalva maneuver, what is happening to the venous return?
Increases.
Huh?
Increases.
Valsalva maneuver is opposite to expiration. Inspiration increases.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
No doubt. Good. Sometimes we need to be crazier than the subject. Alright? But if you logically understand subject, nobody will stop you to become a topper. Right? Topper is more to do with the determination, self-belief. Remember, we all started like you only. We all started sitting in reading rooms, sleeping on the tables, keeping some deadlines, and unable to meet those deadlines of daily, right? In the middle, suddenly notification comes. We don't know what is optimum content to study. We all pass it through that. And we thought this time we are going to be topper. But later on, after exam is over, this I did wrong, that I did wrong, this I did wrong. All those unwanted pregnancy situations. Once more normalize ourselves. Once more sit and prepare. Oh, we passed all that. Everybody passes. Not you, not me, or anyone. But really, it is not. So many dramatics are really not required because there is no brainer in preparation. If you properly prepare. Logical things logically understand. And understand and remember only the things that are asked by examiners. Nothing, not even 1 inch more than that. Don't talk about acquiring knowledge while preparing for entrance. It's like starting a family with a commercial sex worker, right? So it has no meaning, right? It's nowhere. Only for the purpose of exam, learn, right? If it is not required for exam, don't learn, right? Now, Valsalva maneuver, forced expiration. Decrease venous return. If there is a decreased venous return, decreased preload, decreased filling of the blood into the ventricle. So what is the problem in aortic stenosis? There is a valvular stenosis. Will the murmur will be more if more blood need to be pumped against stenotic valve or less blood need to be pumped? If more blood is there and it has to negotiate to a stenotic valve, murmur will be more. But here, because of Valsalva preload decreased, less blood is passing, so murmur will decrease. So that is the difference. A valvular level aortic stenosis is causing decreased murmur with Valsalva, whereas subvalvular level obstruction in the LVOT, outflow tract, what is it doing? Subvalvular level obstruction is increasing the systolic murmur. That is the main difference which you need to appreciate. Now, standing, squatting don't have much effect on aortic stenosis murmur. Hand grip exercise, inspiration, they also do not have much. But post PVC, right? Post PVC, when the inotropic state of the heart increases, post PVC also has an effect of increasing afterload. And any increased afterload also will worsen the aortic stenosis murmur. Then comes VSD, mitral regurgitation. What happens to those murmurs? Valsalva maneuver, what is the effect of it into the chamber size? Valsalva maneuver? Decreased preload, decreased chamber size, decreased amount of the blood in the ventricle chamber. So obviously the MR and VSD also will be lesser. So murmur decreases with Valsalva. Then if there's a hand grip exercise, hand grip is releasing catecholamines. Catecholamines are increasing afterload. If there is an increased afterload, what happens to the MR? Increases, because high afterload in the aorta will increase the pressure inside the ventricle, which will cause more regurgitation, more VSD to happen. That's the funda. All right. Then comes very important point: mitral valve prolapse. Right now, what is the effect of Valsalva? First of all, Valsalva, what will it do to the preload? Decreases preload. Chamber size? Huh? Decreases the chamber size. When the chamber size is decreased, will the crowding of the chamber will be more or less?
Crowding will be more, sir.
Crowding will be more. So the chance of prolapsing are high. So that is the reason MVP murmur with Valsalva maneuver will increase. Agree? Then standing. What will happen with standing? There is a decreased venous return, smaller size of the chamber, greater amount of prolapse. Squatting, opposite. Increased venous return. Increased venous return, larger chamber size, less amount of prolapse. Hand grip increase the catecholamines, and typically because of that there is increased afterload, and that also will increase the back pressure from aorta to left ventricle to prolapse. Right? So this is what we need to remember. Now, what is the close differential diagnosis of all these conditions? Aortic stenosis causes systolic murmur. VSD causes systolic murmur. MR causes systolic murmur. HOCM causes systolic murmur. MVP causes systolic murmur. But for the HOCM, is there anybody who is closest mimicker? Is it the AS or VSD or MR or MVP? Which is the closest fellow mimicking HOCM? MVP. Why? Because MVP murmur intensity with Valsalva maneuver is increasing, whereas MR VSD decreasing, AS also decreasing. Only HOCM is Valsalva increasing, and MVP also is increasing. In all the features, MVP and HOCM look very similar. Both the things, whenever the Chamber size is smaller, obstruction is more. Chamber size is larger, obstruction is less. But there is a differentiator. What is that? Hand grip. If you did hand grip, what happened to HOCM? Hand grip increased catecholamines.
Yeah, it decreases in hand grip in HOCM.
In hand grip, catecholamines increased. Afterload increased. To fight against that afterload, ventricular inotropic contractility increased. When the contractility of the ventricle increased, it overcame the obstruction. So that is the reason HOCM murmur decreased with hand grip. But MBB murmur
Increases in the hand grip.
increases in the hand grip. All right? You remember? और एक बार बोलता हूँ आपके लिए. Apologize if I am a very obsessive old timer, but I want you to fully understand correctly. No tension. Hand grip increases. Increased catecholamines effect on afterload.
Increases afterload.
If increased afterload is there, what happens to the left ventricle? Contractility.
Increases.
And will that overcome the HOCM or not?
No, it doesn't. It overcomes by decreasing the murmur.
Correct. It overcomes the obstruction,
Yes.
and hence
Decreases.
HOCM murmur decreases with hand grip. But the same situation, when hand grip is done, catecholamines are released, after load increased, what is the effect of that on MVP? After load increased, back pressure is more and prolapse is more. So hand grip increases the murmur of MVP but decreases the murmur of HOC. Please. और एक बार after lunch is over, no? ठंडे दिमाग से, और एक बार आपस में डिस्कस डेफिनेटली करना पड़ेगा. Then comes tricuspid regurgitation. Let's talk about tricuspid regurgitation. What is the effect of Valsalva?
It decreases
Venous return. So that's the preload. Preload decreased. So when the preload decreased, into the right atrium, the amount of blood going right ventricle also decreased. So regurgitant blood also decreased. So that is the reason Valsalva decreases the tricuspid regurgitation. But what is important? Tricuspid is a right-sided valve. So inspiration always will increase venous return and increase the right-sided murmurs. Always remember that. Okay? Then you have something called flow murmur.
Other murmurs are increased.
No. All murmurs increase, right-sided murmurs increase with inspiration. And other murmurs are not affected by inspiration. Left-sided murmurs are not affected by inspiration. That's what you need to remember. Okay? That means if your roommate is not studying well, means it does not mean you are studying very good. You are not affected. That means you are not. We don't know whether you are studying better or less, right? So flow murmur. You do analysis for the flow murmur also, similar lines. Okay. So that's a point. So this brings us to the end of the today's momentous afternoon, doctor. So dynamic auscultation of murmurs is something that we finish. So once more we will take up the remaining topics. మీరు చదువుకునే దగ్గరికి ఇక్కడికి ఎంత దూరము టైం మీ ఇంటికి దగ్గరేనా నేను ఒకవేళ పాసిబుల్ అయితే ఐ ట్రై టు కమ్ టుమారో ఈవినింగ్ Monday evening or I'll just let's keep in touch. So I will let you know in the morning. So even every day 2-3 hours also we can have discussion and whenever possible on Sundays longer discussion. So but if more number of people come they will be missing the remaining days. So it's okay. The point is and also I will be making the 1-minute videos of these 2-3 points and all that. So that is another round of revision, right? Thanks for coming on the day one. Probably, if you would have not come to the session, I would have been the most disappointed kid. Huh? So that's it. Thank you. మన టోటల్ కౌంట్ ఎంతకు వచ్చింది 125
Yes, sir.
124.